Nowhere in Western Europe, or for that matter in North America, has a right-wing populist succeeded on their own. It's always been necessary to have the collaboration, in this case of the right, of established conservative forces.
Is there a Korean summit? What the hell is going on in Italy? And elections in Colombia. Hi everyone, I'm Ian Bremmer and welcome to your GZERO world. This week, your big interview with Princeton Professor of Politics, expert on populism, Jan Muller. We're gonna do big picture, lots of forest, not as many individual trees. Also have puppet regime. President Putin is getting his beach bod in place for Crimea, a little bit of Sochi maybe. And I've got office hours going to be taking your questions. But first, your world this week. Donald J. Trump, Kim Jong-Un. Are they going to meet? We have no idea. It looked off again. Now it looks a little more on again. Probably change a couple more times before we get there. But the North Korea situation actually looks more stable and more peaceful than it did before. There is a lot of symmetry, just not involving the Americans. They've met twice now with the South Korean president, both meetings extremely warm, neither meeting asking permission from Washington. Same thing true with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. 2 meetings now. It's really important. The Chinese are the most important player in North Korea. Think about the Russians and their importance in the Syrian conflict. The United States said Assad must go. Trump saying North Korea must denuclearize, but ultimately you pay a lot more attention to the people that have the skin in the game. In Syria, that's the Russians with the military on the ground. In North Korea, that's the Chinese with 90% of the North Korean trade coming from Beijing. Whether or not Trump ultimately meets with Kim Jong-un has more to do with whether Trump can handle being a part of a multilateral process. He likes being by himself. America first. Sometimes that works for him when he's pushing the South Koreans or the Brazilians to a tougher trade deal. Sometimes he pulls out, like the Iranian deal, like the Paris Climate Accord, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But on North Korea, the only way Trump gets a deal is if he works with a bunch of other players. And so far, he hasn't shown a lot of inclination to do that. We might end up with a summit, and Trump might be able to show more progress than any other president, but ultimately he's going to have to do it with other countries, not just by himself with Kim Jong-un. We'll see where we go. Now to Italy, where yet another European country can't seem to put a government together. In this case, it's on the back of a huge populist backlash, getting rid of the establishment political parties, voting for the Northern League on the right in the Italian north, it's wealthy there, and the Five-Star Movement on the left down in the Italian south, it's not as wealthy there. Everybody in the middle pushed to the side. A lot of Euroscepticism around this election, and the president of Italy decided not to let them put a government together because they wanted a Eurosceptic in charge. Now that means you're going to get new elections. They won't tolerate a caretaker. The parliament will say no. Those new elections, when they happen, you're going to get even more anger, even more populist. But you know what they're not going to get is an Italian exit from the European Union. That's all about politics. It's not about what the Italian people actually want. When they finally do put a government together, either in the summer or in the fall, we're going to have a lot of challenges in working with the Europeans. We're going to have budgets that are going to shoot through any fiscal plans. That's a challenge for a heavily indebted Italian nation, but it's not a referendum for an Ital exit or a Quitaly, as some call it. That I wouldn't worry about. And in Colombia, there is another fight between left and right here. Second round now coming in the presidential elections between, on the right, Ivan Duque, on the left, Gustavo Petro. But the real issue is that everyone is unhappy with the existing president, Mr. Santos, by far the most unpopular in recent memory, on the back of an economy that's not doing that well, and a deal with the former leftist guerrillas, the FARC, basically giving them a bunch of amnesty and not treating them like former guerrillas, which means the average Colombian is really unhappy with maintaining that deal. It's going to create bigger security problems going forward, and whoever wins, probably Duque on the right. The business community will be fine with it. It's going to be really tough for him to govern. That's it for me. Now let's turn to you and office hours.
Donald Trump is viewed by many around the world as being unfit for office. My question would be, how has he been able to achieve so much with North Korea when those that have come before him have all failed?
On North Korea, Trump was willing to try. He's much less risk averse than previous presidents, looking at a small possibility of an impossible blow-up. Trump's willing to accept some of that risk, willing to go where people haven't done before, and also wants to make a little bit of history. With the North Korea situation, it's less about him threatening military strikes. It's more about him pushing the Chinese and being willing to do so to get them to squeeze North Korea. That's what actually moved the North Koreans here. It's why we've actually seen more progress on the North Korea situation under Trump than previous presidents, but it doesn't mean he's ultimately going to make the breakthrough. That is still an open question.
Do you think that any agreement that comes out of the Korea summit will be verifiable? In other words, will the United States, other countries, or organizations like the United Nations be able to verify whether or not North Korea is keeping up with its obligation?
North Korean history tells you they are very likely to cheat. However, so did Iranian history, and they were actually keeping up with the verification of the deal. All of Trump's advisors were willing to admit to that. The question is, what are we asking the North Koreans to do, first of all? If it's full denuclearization, I'd be really surprised if they don't cheat. If it's something more limited, I still expect there are going to be big problems with implementation. Let's keep in mind that even with their goodwill with the South Koreans, they're still engaging in massive cyber attacks that hurt the South Korean economy. Right now, every day hasn't been stopped. We are so far from a deal with the Americans that's more than symbolism and actually starts to bite on the national security side. Color me skeptical.
Looking at the fate of Muammar Gaddafi, for Kim Jong-Un, what would constitute a credible security guarantee from the US?
The Gaddafi model is not going to be a security guarantee for Kim Jong-un. That's pretty clear, and that's one of the reasons John Bolton likes to talk about it. He doesn't really want a deal. A deal that would work for the North Koreans is one that doesn't completely get rid of their nukes. They want to show they have the ultimate deterrent, but that doesn't mean they have to be able to hit the Americans. Remember, the initial red line for Donald Trump was ICBMs that can hit the lower 48 in the US. Do I think the North Koreans could be induced and coerced into getting rid of those ICBMs? I think that's plausible for a lot of money and for some Chinese and South Korean backstops. Maybe even regional ballistic missiles to get the Japanese happier? Plausible. But their nukes and a delivery system, at least across the border for South Korea, that I don't think is possible, and I don't think we should necessarily be trying for it. But I'm okay with talking about it. That's one of the things you give away in a tough negotiation. We'll see where we get. And now Mr. Putin is going to pump you up. Let's go to Puppet Regime.
Коля, put 60 days on clock. Trump, I challenge you to 60-day fitness challenge to become the lean, mean, dictating machine I know you can be. Right now you disgust me. You are fat and weak, and you let press and Congress walk all over you. Your 60 days begins now.
And now our big interview with Professor of Politics from Princeton University, Jan Muller. Let's get into it.
Jan, delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Tough time for liberal democracy in these days. Doesn't look like that's where the world is heading. Why do you think that is?
It's a very strange situation because on the one hand, we don't really have an obvious ideological rival to democracy. Yes, there's obviously China, but unlike in the Cold War, when there was a real war of ideas, and we have fifth columns, in the West, people who said these are actually attractive ideas, very few people at this point openly say, we really want something completely different than democracy. So the greatest threats to democracy in a certain way come from within. They come especially from populists who officially say, we're actually the better Democrats. We believe more in participation by citizens. That's completely untrue. In fact, they always exclude citizens in one form or another. But I think to really grasp our situation, we need to understand that the biggest threat is from within, that it's in a certain way unprecedented. I don't think that 20th century delivers to us any lessons on a silver platter in terms of what we have to do next. It's precisely responding to populists by showing that what they promise to do, which is to empower the people, they actually don't.
Who do you think is most effective right now on the world stage at advancing this populist moment?
So there are a couple of actors who really have demonstrated conclusively that contrary to conventional wisdom, populists can really govern and they can specifically govern as populists, which is to say, as actors who do ultimately not recognize anything like a legitimate opposition. So we've seen Orban in Hungary,
Viktor Orban, president of Hungary.
Kaczynski in Poland, Erdogan in Turkey. They've all built a particular kind of state, Orban has declared it an illiberal state, where we even see, if it didn't sound so perverse, a particular populist art of governance emerging, which has distinct characteristics. It involves mass clientelism, it involves hijacking the state for the governing party, it involves suppressing civil society, and always in the name of democracy, and always with the claim that populists, and only populists, truly represent the people. And that is, in a sense, a very coherent package. I'm not saying they're invincible, but this idea that, oh, by definition, they can't govern because there are protest movements. Once you're in government, you cannot keep protesting against yourself, or a variation of a certain kind of liberal naivete. They all have these horrendously simplistic policy ideas, so on day 2 of their administration, it's going to be obvious that nothing works in practice. I think these sorts of views have been refuted very comprehensively.
Orban himself in Hungary has also looked to Russia as a kind of a model for him. Now, they have elections in Russia, but very few people refer to them as an illiberal democracy. They call them just authoritarian. First, why the difference? And second, why the attraction?
Personally, I think we're not doing the right thing when we call regimes like Orban's an illiberal democracy. Because what he has done is to infringe on rights which are essential for democracy itself. Right to free assembly, right to free speech, media pluralism in particular. According to some estimates, up to 90% of the media are now owned in Hungary by oligarchs close to the government. So it's not just liberalism that is suffering here. It's not just the rule of law, it's basic rights essential for democracy itself. And since people like Orban himself tend to say, look, of course I'm a liberal. You know, you're not criticizing me by telling me I'm a liberal. I want to be a liberal. That's my alternative to what the EU in particular has been pushing. We should be very clear and say, no, democracy itself is being damaged. Doesn't mean that it's a full dictatorship. Again, it would be misleading to basically look for images that are like dictatorships in the 20th century. There are no sort of obvious human rights violations. You go to Budapest today, you're going to say, it's lovely, it's hedonistic, it's a lot of fun. You know what's no problem around here. So it's done in a much more subtle way. And I think we should reserve the term damaged democracy, or as some of our colleagues have suggested, competitive authoritarianism, or maybe electoral democracy for these kinds of regimes, and not do them the favor of basically still including them in the community of democracy.
Turkey closer to the Polish-Hungarian model or closer to the Russian model?
If you push me, I would say Erdogan is closer to the Russian model. In a certain way, it's not obvious that you want to be closer to the Russian model. I'm not an expert on Turkey, but I think Erdogan, in certain ways, has maneuvered himself into a position where he cannot step back and he cannot step down. And he's much more brutal. He's seen as much more repressive. He now has to kind of keep escalating. There's really no way back, I think, to a kind of Hungary-Poland situation where you end up fooling a lot more actors and also provide a climate which, let's say, business is still much happier with than sort of having the stigma of basically doing deals with a quasi-authoritarian regime.
And Hungary, they've won a few elections now. The last elections they won with pretty big turnout compared to what the polls were expecting. What are they getting right? In other words, why are the people responding consistently to support Orban, given that there are real alternatives in that government, at least for now?
If you look at the decisive elections, 2010 Hungary, 2015 Poland, Orban and Kaczynski, who of course didn't even run, didn't go around and say, hey, vote for me, I'm going to abolish the rule of law, it's going to be great. No, they presented themselves as completely mainstream conservative / Christian democratic parties who wanted to raise the minimum wage, do nice things for families with lots of kids, so completely normal things. And voters responded as democratic theory would tell them to respond in a two-party system. In Hungary, the left was discredited for various reasons. In Poland, there was a sense that, while Civic Platform had been very good and effective, maybe they'd become complacent in power. It was time to give the other guys a chance. So to now retroactively say, oh, these illiberal authoritarian outcomes, that's what people really want, I think is a big mistake. And basically then leads to a sort of re-entry of typical Western prejudices about, these benighted parts of Europe, and they never really understood what democracy is about. They're all illiberal. I think that's in no way justified.
Now, of course, the reason why East Europe is so interesting to a lot more people these days is because there's a fear that these waves are starting to crash upon the shores of some larger democracies as well. I'm wondering to what extent you see that starting to play out in the United Kingdom with Brexit and with Jeremy Corbyn, or in the United States with Trump and with Bernie Sanders and others. What are the similarities? What are the differences?
For better or for worse, professors don't decree how people use language. But if I could get rid of one image today, it would be that of the wave. Usually then, Brexit and Trump are the great examples for how we've seen this rise of populism. But with all due respect to Nigel Farage, Brexit was not single-handedly brought about by him. It was basically conservative collaborators, established Tories, who basically made the case that Brexit was a sensible idea. In this country, Trump was not the candidate of a spontaneous grassroots protest movement of, as the cliche has it, white male workers. He was the candidate of a very established party. And as abnormal as you might say the candidate was, it was a very normal election in that more than 90% of self-identified Republicans simply came out for the Republican candidate. So contrary to the image of the wave, nowhere in Western Europe, or for the matter in North America, has a right-wing populist succeeded on their own. It's always been necessary to have the collaboration, in this case of the right, of established conservative forces. And even in Central and Eastern Europe, it's not obvious that Kaczynski and Orban should really be read as freestanding populist triumphs, because, at least in the case of Orban, his party is still seen as the mainstream Christian democratic party, and supported as such, cynically in my view, by many Western Europeans. So I think we are missing the actual essential development today, which is not that all of a sudden there is this unstoppable force. Of course, that's what populists themselves want to make us believe. And if you push me, I think the much bigger danger is actually supposed mainstream parties reinventing themselves as de facto populist parties.
But is there not an argument to be made that a lot of Americans feel like the system is indeed rigged? That if there's democracy, there's not democracy for them?
It's one thing to say, look, I want to get rid of these constraints. And somebody might do that. Somebody, there was a left-wing case for Brexit, for instance. Again, not my kind of case, but I think people not irrationally said, look, the UK Parliament can only introduce socialism if we get out of the EU. It was a rational thing to say. I don't think socialism is going to be introduced by Parliament, but there's not a crazy thing to say. So get rid of these constraints. In that sense, get rid of some of the factors that might, quote-unquote, rig it. But that's very different from populists in power who've never run out of yet another scapegoat, of yet another, as the cliche has it, shadowy international elite that is preventing them from finally implementing the people's singular, authentic will. And they don't really care about changing anything. In fact, they live off that kind of conflict. It's in their interest to keep finding these scapegoats. They want to keep a culture war going. They want to keep saying, here is the shadowy enemy out there.
So what do you do when you're trying to create a more thoughtful electorate, and you don't want people believing these wacko crazy things, pizza joint that's trafficking in pedophilia, for example, right? The Sandy Hook was all a fake. And yet you look through history and you see Iran-Contra that was lied up and down on, the Cuban Missile Crisis, missiles in Turkey, we completely deny, turns out absolutely they were there. Erdogan, absolutely paranoid, and yet it turns out they were really out to get him. There was, a coup attempt, and there were probably others that were aborted.
I would try to do two things. One sort of thing is really directed towards professional politicians, and the other one is more about structural issues. So professional politicians, I think, have a responsibility, on the one hand, to concede that on certain questions, yes, we can have a democratic debate. Very controversial things, like immigration. So if somebody says, look, I want to radically reduce the number of people coming in, it's not what I would like, and I would push back as strongly as I can with arguments. But I would not resort to the cheap trick of saying, this is automatically undemocratic. You're not allowed to say this around here. You got to give people the space to make these claims. At the same time, if somebody, for instance, then says, Angela Merkel has a secret plan to replace the German folk with Syrians, then you got to be as strong as possible in drawing a red line and saying, wait a minute, now we've left the territory of policy debate, where people can say whatever they want up to a degree. Now we're really in the realm of conspiracy theory. And this is a conspiracy theory. And here are the reasons why it is. Now, obviously, the populist in this case is not going to sort of recoil and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was doing conspiracy theory. But it's not about him. It's about basically citizens saying, yeah, I might agree with some of these policy positions, but I don't really believe it when people tell me day and night that we live in a system that's comparable to the late days of, Soviet-style East Germany. Now, there might be some people who believe that, but these are not, let's say, 13% of the German population who voted for the Alternative for Germany, one of whose representatives was pushing the conspiracy theory I just gave you. So that's, I think, the responsibility of individual actors. More structurally,
yeah.
I would pick up an idea that some of our colleagues in American law have been banning about, which is to say that we should think of the usual suspects, i.e. Facebook, Google, and so on, as basically having a certain degree of fiduciary power. In other words, they're more like lawyers or doctors. They're also media, for sure. But they're also, in a sense, now in a position that they know stuff about us that normally lots of people in the old world of media would not have known about us. Okay, you go out, you buy the New York Times, that doesn't mean the New York Times knows anything about you. Now through the internet, they know stuff about you. They can manipulate you in certain ways. They have an extra responsibility, which previously, arguably, neither mass parties nor mass media really had in this way. And I think that's then the area where more needs to be regulated, without thereby, of course, comprehensively shutting down free speech or anything of that sort. But basically recognizing that the infrastructure of democracy as a whole has changed, that there are ways of bringing in more fairness, more balance, to coin a phrase, and at the same time leaving, of course, a wide area for completely open debate. And again, going back to the initial point, open debate about lots of controversial questions, because in many areas, it's simply not the case of unreasonable versus reasonable policies. In the light of different value commitments, different life experiences, people have different views, and we'll try to convince them as best as we can, but that's really all we can do. And I think we should not resort to basically telling them at a certain point, look, you're just being unreasonable, you're just being irrational. I think that's not going to go over well.
Jan Muller, delighted to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's it for our show this week. Next week, we're off. We'll be back the week after. But in the interim, if you want to follow us, gzeromedia.com, subscribe to our podcast, watch our YouTube channel, all that stuff. See you soon.